Oh, cool. Can you just hear me all right? Just want to make sure that everything's all good. Sweet. Okay, so I have a lot to get through. So what am I going to bring you in this speech? I'm firstly going to do some setup, some characterization, like what do these things look like and why. So I think the first thing to note here is that what these beauty pageants kind of do, and I'm going to specifically focus on beauty pageants for young kids. The reason being is because I think that at older ages, I think people have the choice to be able to do that. I mean, I would support banning them, but that's not where this debate is going to go. So I think in terms of younger kids, the thing that these pageants do is it creates a norm around physical attraction, the way that you present yourself, and I think that's really harmful because firstly, that's only good for the people who win, but secondly, it's different to a normal sport where when you lose a beauty pageant, you don't necessarily have a criteria to say, oh, I'm going to improve me, or I'm going to improve my performance per se by doing this thing differently. And the reason being is because they're purely based on subjectivity, and that means that there is no criteria for winning aside from just looking the best. And the reason why that's particularly harmful is because it creates this emphasis on I guess you could say physical perfection. And the reason why that's particularly harmful is because particularly during formative years of a person, and that is to say 2 years old to 5 or 6 years old, the things that they pick up at that age, they tend to stick with them for the rest of their life. And so at that point where you are doing things like getting spray tans, getting hair extensions, covering your face in makeup, that kind of thing, I think that's really harmful because that creates this idea that you need to do those things to look perfect, and and you need to look perfect to win. What that does is it creates a competition or between people to say that I look good, but I don't look as good as another person. And at that point, you create this culture around looking the best and looking better than everyone else, which I think is really harmful. Because at that point, beauty is obviously subjective. There is no criteria as to what makes a person conventionally attractive or conventionally good looking. At the point where you instill this idea of what a criteria could be, then you create a culture around this is what beauty looks like, and then everyone outside of that is really disadvantaged. There are specific groups of people that I'll talk to later, but in terms of this kind of thing, I'll get to that later in the speech. But for now, I'm going to pass the microphone back to you to hear your opening.
All right, so basically this is a policy debate talking about whether banned, and ban would imply a governmental action. So basically what we're kind of looking here is I'm going to set up two or three main tests to kind of look at how to vision. The first is the fact that it's a policy. In order to ban beauty pageants, it needs to be argued that there is a systemic harm, not simply backed up by anecdotes or stories, but a systemic harm that is proven throughout the system with evidence and hard facts, not merely ideas or speculations or what you think is usually the case. Second, we need to, assuming that's met, we need to figure out why beauty pageants are different from any other type of competition, say singing, sports, anything like that. And you touched on that, so I'll be addressing that in a second. So that's the second thing that needs to be satisfied, is why beauty pageants are unique among all forms of competition. Because simply put, competition, there's going to be winners and losers, and some who are going to get upset, and it can be emotionally disturbing when you lose a competition. I've lost football games in my high school career, and that was upsetting. But it's still a competition, so we need to understand why beauty pageants are distinct from every other form of competition. And the third is more of a governmental action, and that is kind of the general idea of beauty pageants are a form of association. And at least here in America, we recognize that as an inherent human right, that people can associate with who they wish. So based on that, whenever the government's looking at whether or not they can pass a law restricting those civil liberties, they have to pass what's called the strict scrutiny. Side fails all three of these tests. For this test specifically, we're going to see that there's not a threat to the public. People can choose whether or not they want to be in this. So, and then second of all, it's a competition where people can win or lose. They get to choose whether or not they go in there. There's no systemic harm. It's just like any other form of competition. You don't like to play basketball doesn't mean we should ban basketball, or you think that there are bad things about basketball that, you can fall on asphalt and skin your arm. Like I skinned my arm in rugby just on last Saturday. That was a form of thing I had to take in. So there's no specific governmental interest in banning all of these. Second of all, if we were to do anything, I think we could argue that maybe children one should be more regulated, maybe an age limit or something like that. But the resolution clearly states beauty pageants should be banned, and we're not talking about just a subset. We're talking about all of them. So unless you can prove beauty pageants should be banned, then
Cool. So as I went through all of these things in my introduction, I'm going to go through them one by one. Firstly, why they're unique among competitions, because there is no criteria to improve. That is to say that in a rugby competition as a team, you may have done something wrong. It could be a strategic error that you can improve on the next time you do that. As a track and field athlete, when I lose races, I am able to look at that race and look where I did wrong, and then look at the next race that I do to see if I can improve that. Beauty pageants are unique to that because they are subjective. There is nothing to say that you did this bad, therefore in your next pageant you should do this differently to win, simply because it is purely subjective, right? But in terms of like this policy thing, like these three things that I need to prove. Firstly, a public threat. Let me just tell you, children don't always get to choose to do this. Usually it's their parents being like, hey, you should do this thing, or hey, you are going to do this thing. That is not a choice. They do not get to choose to opt out of that because their parents are forcing them to do that. At that point, that's the first public harm that it has. But secondly, and like I also do have like a lot of solid evidence for this. So like, thanks for the segue there. Let me just find it though. So like Sydney Brown, psychologist, said claimed that, you know, if these bodies don't develop in the way that like the children are accustomed to post beauty pageants, then it creates this idea of like you are not perfect and creates self-esteem issues, because I've spent their whole life in these pageants thinking that like this is what makes them look good, and at the point where their bodies physically develop outside of that, that creates self-esteem issues. That's the first thing to say there. The second thing to say is that at the point where like, sorry, I'm just trying to find these, like I have a lot of them written down. It's just like not structured in a way that like I can do it in order. Martina M. Cartwright in 2006, she claimed that like, or research that she actually did, found that 40% of participants in beauty pageants in that year ended up with psychological problems because of them not winning, because of like criterias. So there's the thing there. And the second part of that is that 60% of people were unhappy during those competitions. The reason being is because they didn't actually want to be there, but because their parents forced them to do that. She also did a study in 2007 that stated that like the majority of women who participated in beauty pageants, particularly those who didn't win, ended up with worse self-esteem outcomes than those who didn't on an overall proportional scale. But what that suggests is that those who don't win, they leave thinking like they're not good enough. Now, I also preempted a lot of what you said in my introduction, where I said, particularly about choice and freedom of liberty, when I said that like I'm purely restricting this debate to children beauty pageants, simply because I understand that like adults have a choice. While I'm in favor of banning them as well because of all of these harms, like I recognize that they have a choice to do that. And in this case, like the policy should be that children's beauty pageants are banned for that reason. And this law like addresses those threats because it prevents these children from developing those self-esteem and mental health issues. I'll go into more detail later. And it's also the least restrictive because like there is no reason as to why you shouldn't ban them. Like I addressed freedom, that kind of thing earlier. Okay, I have the microphone back, and I also just missed your entire speech, so like I didn't get any of that. So I'm gonna pass it back to you, and then like you can go through that again.
Okay, so I didn't hear anything after I think a minute into your second speech. So to be perfectly honest, so I'm just going to pass it back to you. If you could start that, like I got Sydney Brown, that point about the psychologist, and then it started cutting in then I heard a name like Martina, maybe something like that. I'm not sure, so I'm just pass it back to you.
Cool. So the second psychologist that I quoted was Martina Cartwright, who in 2006 or did two studies. 2006 participants came out of these beauty pageant psychological problems that looked like self-esteem issues, body image, that kind of thing. The other 60% in those beauty pageants also were just unhappy being in that situation in the first place, probably because their parents wanted them to be there. They didn't have a choice. Right, cool. The second study that she did in 2007, she found that women in overall proportionality were more unhappy with their bodies post beauty pageants than people who didn't participate in them. Now, in terms of the other stuff that I like this being a policy debate and the three things that I need to prove, I preface that in my introduction. The first thing to say is that there is a public threat, given all of the things that I just said and all of the things that I'll go into prove later, that like there are worse mental health outcomes that come from these. The second thing is that the law to this threat, or law that like goes with this, is like quite mutually exclusive in terms of like it directly addresses beauty pageants. The third thing to say is that like it's not restrictive because you're not restricting choice, because children don't have the choice to do this in the first instance. Now, what you said about like this freedom of liberty thing, I preempted that in my introduction when I scoped this debate to children's beauty pageant. I'm more than happy to stand by banning adult beauty pageants for these same reasons that I want to ban them both. But in the case that like it does become a freedom of choice thing, I'm more than happy to stand by adults choosing to do this. I would that choice, but I recognize that that is a choice that they need to make. That is why I scoped this debate to children's beauty pageants. I think that that's what the motion should be. I didn't make the motion, so like that's cool. I don't remember the rest of what you said. Oh, did you get my bit about like unique competitions? I don't remember if I did that at the start or the end. Like just a thumbs up so that I know to address it or not. You got it? Cool. Yeah, so I think in that instance, those three things will be proved. I also don't think it's a human right to participate in a beauty pageant. Like, pretty sure it's not. And so in that case, like your point about it being a human right and restricting freedom of liberties doesn't stand. Firstly, because like I told you, these people don't necessarily have choice to do it in the first place. Secondly, because it doesn't have good health outcomes for those people who participate. And then thirdly, for the reasons I just gave, like it is a threat. This law addresses that issue. And then thirdly, it's not particularly restrictive to the people that are engaging in this. The reason why is because I don't give a fuck about parents. They're not the people who have worse mental health outcomes when their child loses. I care more about the kids than the parents. In that instance, I don't care whether it's a freedom of choice for parents to choose to put their kids into this. That is not important. That's not who we care about.
All right, so I'm going to do my best to cover this with the time deficit. Hopefully we'll get it worked out. So functionally, what we're looking at here is he's basically saying parents don't have a right to raise their children as they see fit because the government, experts, all these people who make laws, they're the only person who can make decisions about how we parent our children. So going with that assumption, I think that's absolutely false. Parents have the responsibility and the ability to see out how they raise their children. So first of all, that is simply a truth. If you're going to say that the government should deal with that, that's a different topic we can discuss, but I functionally disagree with that. But the main issue here is we haven't shown any severe issue where the government's saying, okay, this is something where we have to stop it. Sorry, let me rephrase this here. Okay. So basically his point is this is different from sports, different from singing competitions, different from all of that, because there's no objective standards. Well, okay, what about our competitions? What about this debate itself? The fact that we're debating right now is going to be subjectively determined. Now you can argue, well, there's ways to improve a debate. Well, sure there are, but it's still a subjective criteria. And looking at a beauty pageant itself, there are ways to improve. There are ways to have better dresses. Look at to style your hair. I'm like, I don't know much about this. I have three sisters who probably would be much better describing the details of this. But functionally, just saying that, oh, you just walk in and how you're born determines how you ended in the competition. Well, that's simply not true. People work at this. I have an article from the New Statement talking about a woman specifically. I'm sorry, NPR, where a woman who competes for the Miss DC contest talked about how she spent more money on coaching, on getting a better dress, on working out with personal fitness. Let's see here. She also goes into makeup coaching and interview outfit, looking at just the skills she needs to better present herself in a pageant. So there are, in fact, many ways to do better. But functionally, the issue is, okay, this is just a competition. You can get better at it. It's subjective. We shouldn't ban debates because they're subjective, subjectively determined. And in terms of these people dealt with psychological issues, not to be like cold or anything, but the thing is, I wish I was taller. That would make me a better rugby player. That would make me better at different sports that I like to participate in. But it's something that I have to deal with, and that's something that I have to live with. If I can't get over it, then that's just an issue on me. And with Sydney Brown's, we don't develop into the perfect body. Again, if students or children are going around and saying, I'm not perfect, well, they're going to see that both in real life and the beauty pageant. The beauty pageant might focus on that more, but it's also prevalent in real life. You're going to see more attractive people and stuff deal with the fact that you don't look as good as them, but you have other talents that are just as valuable.
I'm going to address all of your stuff, and then I'm going to go into all of the stuff that directly responds to that. Firstly, do parents have a responsibility to raise their kids the way that they want? Yes, they do, but we also can see that when the government has a direct interest in the harms that accrue from that parenting style, then we do restrict them. In the same way that when a parent does a bad thing to that child, then that child gets taken away from that parent. The government always restricts the parent's ability to raise their kids in certain ways if it accrues a certain harm for that group of people. If the parent is raising their child and has no bad health outcomes, then that's fine. The truth is that it does have bad health outcomes, as I told you in my introduction. The second thing I'm going to say here is that you are still holding on to this idea of adult beauty pageants. I told you in my introduction, I told you in my second speech that I'm scoping the debate to children. You need to address that, but I'm more than happy to address adults as well. But the reason why this is important, you said that a woman who competes in Miss DC, there's ways that she got coaching, she got better dresses, that kind of thing. That's something that kids can't do. That's something that a lot of kids can't do, right? It is a lot easier for an adult who competes in these competitions to make their own choices. At the point where a child is doing this, it is harder for them, particularly if they come from disadvantaged families anyway. And so please engage with the actual scope of the debate or prove why that scope is bad. You have done neither of those things. The third thing to say in terms of this idea about debating not being subjective, the difference between debating and a beauty pageant is there is still some form of objective criteria. That is to say perhaps you didn't say something in a particular way that made it more persuasive. You missed certain things, you missed rebuttal. There are things that you can improve between your speeches. There are not things that you can improve in a beauty pageant that make you better than the next person, because it literally looks like someone having a better dress. How do they get better dressed? They have more money. Some people just don't have enough money to actually do those things. At the point where debating is different, it is intrinsic to you. At that point, there is a net harm coming from beauty pageants because there is no objective criteria to improve. While debating, yes, is subjective to some extent, there is still an objective criteria that you can follow that will help you improve. So I've done that. And so onto the substantive part of this, in terms of this idea that sometimes you won't be perfect, sometimes there will always be people better than you. That's fine, as long as you don't have the norm that comes with that suggests that to be better than someone, you have to be better looking. Beauty pageants exacerbate those norms. What does that look like? Creating this idea that for you to win a contest, you have to be better looking than other people. That suggests that the people who don't win are not as good looking as them, which creates that norm to begin with. Without beauty pageants, those norms do not exist to the same extent, because you are not saying that to win a competition, you have to be the best looking person there. At that point, then we allow for beauty to actually be subjective, as opposed to trying to input an objective criteria into something that doesn't need it, i.e. the fact that beauty is subjective and is different to each individual person.
All right, so let's look at the fact that a beauty pageant is subjective. I'm actually going to turn this argument. If looking at life, if I can't deal with the fact that a single or maybe a panel of 3 judges don't look like the way how I look, then that's going to be a problem, because all throughout life, you're going to deal with the issue of if people think you're attractive or unattractive. That's something you're going to have to deal with in life. Functionally, beauty pageants. I mean, here's the thing. Yes, parents force their kids to do that, but that's a non-unique argument for any other sport, singing competition, any skill you can think of. Parents are forcing their kids into this. Is that a bad thing if a kid doesn't want to? I mean, honestly, it probably is not the best thing if a parent forces their kid to do something. But that's a non-unique argument to beauty pageants. So any point about that is non-unique to beauty pageants and shouldn't be considered in the round. Functionally, one, we're all going to have to deal with the advantages or disadvantages we have within life. If we can't deal with those specifically, that's going to be an issue for the rest of our life, and that's non-unique to beauty pageants. He's focused. My opponent is focusing a lot on the fact that it's how we look. Well, my beauty, or lack thereof, is only one aspect of who I am. And yes, it's how a lot of people perceive you. But then I don't understand how my opponent has been unable to show the difference why beauty is particularly different from any other characteristic that us as humans have, whether it's singing ability, intelligence. I mean, think about school. School is the whole time we're basically told, like, if you're not intelligent, you're dumb and worthless in society. So if anything, should we ban school? In the same way, it doesn't make any sense to say just because a certain activity can be traumatic for certain people that we need to ban it. Functionally, we're not going to ban sports, we're not going to ban anything else. He keeps saying that beauty pageants and sports are completely different. Well, I don't see much difference. They're just different attributes being worked on. He talked about how it's completely subjective. Well, the subjective part, in fact, means it should be worth even less. You know, it's one thing to be like, oh, this person just doesn't like me. Get new friends. Or this person to think I'm attractive. Well, don't hang around them if they're going to be toxic and not tell you that you look good. And I get that children are, are forced to this. But again, it's the same way. If, here's the thing. If it's systemic or not. Now, he's talked about parents forcing them into that. Well, how many? How many are being forced in there? I believe he said a study somewhere in here where it's, I don't know if he said a number issue. There are people with psychological issues. Psychological issues, yeah, they exist, but this isn't different from any other sport. We're not going to ban sports. We're not going to ban singing competitions. He keeps saying they're different, but it's just one attribute versus another. Singing, intelligence versus beauty. All different where it's set at a certain point. I can't get any taller. My height, that's something I can't change. That directly affects my sports ability. We've talked about how these things can change. I have talked about how child specific. I was simply using the DC as example as a woman. She did all those things. Kids can do those things. And money really is an issue because that applies to sports and other stuff.
Yep, cool. So you wanted to talk about whether or not beauty is one aspect that can be changed. It's easier to change your performance in something that has an objective criteria as to what makes that thing good than it is to simply change your appearance to be better. That is particularly harmful. That is a harmful norm that you are sending to particular groups of people. Let's look at those groups of people. At the point where subjective or subconscious racist biases exist, it is far more and say a person of color enters a beauty contest and they don't win, it's probably likely that they're going to walk out of that thinking that it is because of the way that they look. Right at that point, that is really harmful because it sends the message that beauty is not something that you can change and that beauty is objective, right? Regardless of whether it can be changed or not, the point is it is subjective and you are trying to input an objective criteria into that. That is really, really harmful. That is far different to playing basketball. You can practice, basketball, right? Regardless of how tall or short you are, you can practice taking shots for basketball. You can't practice looking better. You cannot practice despite the fact that you wanted to talk about other attributes being important in beauty pageants, the most important thing, particularly for child pageants, is simply looking good. At that point, you then send a message that if you don't look good, there are always going to be people that look better. Now, the thing here, you wanted to talk about that's something that you have to deal with, and that's fine. I understand that you also have to deal with people looking better than you in life, but the normal life without beauty pageants is that you are not told that you are not good looking compared to other people. At that point, that is really harmful. When you specifically enter a competition or a series of competitions and you constantly lose because you are not the best looking person there, that is going to be incredibly damaging to your self-esteem. Like I quoted earlier, this study from Martina Cartwright suggested that 40% of children in beauty pageants in all of 2006, which I think off the top of my head, the number was almost 250,000 people, 40% of those people have walked out with a psychological issue that looks like self-esteem, that looks like anxiety, that looks like all of those mental health outcomes. That is a harm. At that point, then you can't just say this is different to sport. At the point where sport, there is an objective way to improve. That is to say you can practice those things. It is far less likely for you to be able to do that in beauty when the way that you present yourself is the most important part of that. at that point, you are then sending that harmful, pervasive message that says that you are not good enough. You will never be good enough because this is what is conventionally attractive, and you are outside that scope. At that point, you will never be back in that. That is why beauty pageants are bad, because it sends a message that, like, to look attractive, you have to look a certain way. That is not how society works. We understand that beauty is subjective. We tell people that all the time. Why then should we support a beauty pageant which says the opposite?
Now, I'm going to be looking at three main reasons to vote for the con side in this, or negative side in this agreement. And the first one is to be right to associate. Now, my opponent will probably come back and say, well, right to associate, these are children, they are being forced to. Well, the fact is, people get to decide who and with they associate with. And in fact, that's something that happens later in life, where even if you dealt with stuff that in the past, whatever it was, beauty pageants or any other issue that was psychologically damaging, namely school or anything else that could be psychologically damaging, like, let's look at school. If kids come out of there think they're dumb, and I'm like, I didn't research this beforehand, so I don't know the statistics. But let's say someone came out there psychologically damaged, that doesn't mean we should ban school. The two is no proven systemic harm. That's the, sorry, that's not, I'm sorry. My opponent finished his last speech with basically saying, we shouldn't support this. Well, you and I don't have to support this. But the main difference is whether or not this should be banned. Should the government taking action saying, no one is allowed to do this, basically, there is no way this can ever be healthy, there's no way this can ever be beneficial, we're going to ban it all because people can't really handle that other people are better looking than them. The thing is, one, beauty pageants are the only way we can be perfect or valuable in life. That's just silly. If you believe that, then that's a separate issue that isn't applicable just to beauty pageants. It's not something we should be banned, and beauty pageants are the only way in people measure themselves if they're good enough or not. We haven't seen that there is really a need to actually ban all these, rather just disagree with them.
I think my opponent really underestimated the damage that, like, psychological issues that come as a young child can really do. When you are 6 years old and constantly get told that you don't look good enough to win a competition, that's likely to transcribe to the... Particularly, the example that he used was school. We don't ban school because people are dumb and they're disengaged with the schooling system. It is far easier to improve your intelligence than it is to improve your beauty standards, especially when during, like, things like puberty, it goes the other way. At that point, like, I support keeping some,